Nothing impresses me more than someone who can explain complex, complicated science in an easy, understandable, and entertaining way. Our next speaker is an Oxford professor, world-renowned for his unique ability to teach climate science. Please welcome Professor Mylles Allen.
Thank you very much. I'm not so just before dinner you really want to hear from a professor, so I'm not sure about that introduction. I am the last thing between you and dinner, so the only way I can keep you engaged is by annoying, well, there's various ways. I could entertain you, I could amuse you, I could annoy you. I'm going to go for annoying you. And just following on from that Q&A, the depressing truth is, we already, and I don't know if Jeremy's still around or in the audience, but the problem is we already have a near zero marginal cost source of energy. It's called open cast coal, and it's not going anywhere very fast. So we have to get real about this. We have to understand the situation we're in and the fantasy that renewables will somehow make us move on from fossil fuels without actually ever having to make a concrete decision has got to be one we put behind us. Let me put this into perspective. Last month, at the final plenary of the IPCC, which was chaired by Thomas Stocker, who you heard from earlier today, the governments accepted the basic truth, the basic fact, that to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees, we have to limit the total amount of carbon we dump into the atmosphere to less than 1 trillion tons, or rather less if we take into account the warming effect of other greenhouse gases. So let me explain to you therefore what I've got here. I'll put these forward so people can see them, okay? Each of these little lumps of coal, this is the real stuff, this is good British anthracite, and each of these lumps of coal represents 500 billion tons of fossil carbon. Back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when my ancestors started burning this stuff on an industrial scale, we had between 3 and 4 trillion tons of fossil carbon underground, available as a readily available and frighteningly cheap energy source. Over the past 250 years, we've burnt the first 500 billion tons of fossil carbon. At the rate we're going, it'll take us about less than 40 years to burn the next 500 billion tons of fossil carbon. And the reason this matters is the next 500 billion will take us over 2 degrees. Now, where this gets awkward is all of the talks you've heard over this afternoon about solutions to the problem of climate change have been about how do we burn this second 500 billion tons a little slower. But the awful reality of that graph that Thomas Stocker showed you, relating cumulative carbon emissions to global temperature, is it doesn't matter if you burn carbon slower if you end up burning too much in the end. So what none of these solutions to the problem of climate change have addressed, what is the elephant in the corner of the climate change debate that nobody wants to talk about, which is, what are we going to do with the rest of this stuff? With all this fossil carbon that we can't afford to dump into the atmosphere, which is a highly profitable, highly effective energy source, and which belongs to people who have, as they see it, every right to use their property without dumping that carbon into the atmosphere and committing ourselves to dangerous levels of warming. The reason, of course, Jeremy Leggett talked eloquently about the notion of unburnable carbon. But I really struggle with this idea of unburnable carbon because it sounds as though we, having built our prosperity on fossil fuels, are turning around to the citizens of India and China and saying they can't do the same. What I've been arguing to you this evening is we need to accept this stuff, most of it, is going to get burned at some point. Maybe no time soon, but at some point it's going to get burned. And once you accept that reality, the whole nature of the problem of climate change changes. The whole emphasis and what you need to worry about on the climate issue changes the perspective. This is what it means in terms of temperature. We have, if we limit ourselves to 1 trillion tons, these first 2 lumps of coal, temperatures are likely to stay below 2 degrees. If we burn 1.5 trillion tons, temperatures are likely to go above 2 degrees. That gives you an idea of the scientific uncertainty in this. Somewhere in this third lump of coal, we commit ourselves irreversibly to more than 2 degrees of CO2-induced warming. And what's interesting is everybody agrees about this. Even the IPCC's loudest critics all agree that that's pretty much the warming we expect per trillion tons of carbon we dump into the atmosphere. So what does this mean for climate policy? What does this mean for what we can do about it? It means that if we accept we're going to burn too much, the only thing that ultimately matters for the future of our planet is how much carbon we manage to re-inject underground rather than leaving it in the atmosphere. It's all about carbon capture and storage. People don't realize this. People are talking about lots of other things. They're not talking about how do we ensure, suppose by 2200 we've used up all this carbon, how can we make sure that, in the form of CO2, is safely out of the atmosphere? We can put it a different way. Because your pension and the value of Norway's sovereign wealth fund depends on this stuff being burned, we only really have 3 options. Either we're committed to more than 2 degrees of warming, or we develop the technology to use this stuff without dumping the CO2 in the atmosphere, or your pension isn't worth what you thought it was. And that's an uncomfortable possibility. So, what do we do? We need to get to the point, if we want to limit the total amount of carbon we dump into the atmosphere to 1 trillion tons, we need to get to the point where we are injecting CO2 back underground at the same rate that we're extracting fossil carbon before we get to that point, before we release the trillionth ton into the atmosphere. So then I can give you a very simple equation to take away with you. We have roughly 450 billion tons to go before we release the trillionth ton. That means we need to increase the fraction we sequester by 1/450th. It's not very complicated maths. For every billion tons we dump into the atmosphere. That's 0.22%. Since we're currently emitting carbon at a rate of 10 billion tons per year, that means that to be able credibly to say we're on a trajectory to avoid more than 2 degrees of warming, we need to increase the amount we sequester by 2% next year, another 2% the following year, another 2% the following year, and each of these 2% is 200 million tons of carbon or 700 million tons of CO2. These are extraordinary numbers. But it is the simple reality of what's needed if we're to avoid more than 2 degrees of warming. If you look at these numbers in this way, and think of it the way we tend to think of the climate problem, everybody says, well, that's impossible, we can't do it, therefore we're committed to more than 2 degrees. That's not true. There is an institution in the world that can afford, that has the resources, that has the expertise, and above all has the money to solve this problem, to build up the carbon, to build up the sequestered fraction fast enough to avoid more than 2 degrees of warming. And that is the ExxonMobils, the fossil fuel industry that everybody is kind of hoping is going to crawl away in the corner and die. It's not going to crawl away in the corner and die. The only way this problem is going to get solved is if we engage the fossil fuel industry to solve it. And it can be done. The only thing which is really unproven about carbon capture and storage, people often complain that this is an unproven technology. You're putting all your weight into one. You're putting all your emphasis too much onto one technology. It's not proven. The only thing which is really unproven about carbon capture and storage is the cost. And this is where Mongstad, I think, has a lot of lessons for us. Mongstad was cancelled because it had become embarrassingly expensive. In many ways, for the CCS industry, it was almost a relief that Mongstad was cancelled because it was giving everybody the impression that carbon capture was so expensive that nobody, if they weren't Norwegian, would ever be able to afford it. And so what we need to do, you won't find out. When Mongstad was launched, I gather that Jens Stoltenberg compared it to Norway's moonshot. And unfortunately, the analogy with the moonshot seems to me to be all too good. If you write a blank check to industry and say, build me something, it'll be very expensive. And that's okay if you're Kennedy and you're worried about the Russians and you want to get a man on the moon, but it's not okay if you're Norway at in the 21st century and you don't want to do something for an unlimited sum of money. We make the same, I'm criticizing Mongstad, but we are making exactly the same mistake in Britain. We're offering £1 billion to a company to build a CCS demonstrator project. That's a terrible way of finding the cheapest solution to this problem in a way that's replicable, that industry can go on to use elsewhere. Compare these projects to a successful carbon sequestration project, which is currently coming on stream in, of all places, Australia under Tony Abbott. This is the Gorgon Gas Project in Western Australia. When it comes on stream, it'll be the largest carbon sequestration plant in the world, and it's been built with less than 3% of the cost paid for by the taxpayer. It's being built by Chevron, one of those evil fossil fuel, well, and lots of partners as well, I should emphasize, but one of those evil fossil fuel companies that people like to criticize so much. Why is Chevron doing it? It's very simple. The Western Australian government said as a condition for extracting some natural gas, they had to bury this CO2. And as somebody in the industry said to me, we thought about it for about 5 minutes and we said yes. Because the gas was so valuable, it was worth doing anything to have the license to extract it. This is the solution to the problem of climate change. Instead of talking about renewables and worrying about carbon wedges and how we can sort of juggle this energy from that energy and so forth, we simply make it a condition on the extractive fossil fuel industry. If you want to dig this stuff out of the ground, you need to be sequestering a steadily increasing fraction of the carbon you dig up back underground as CO2. It's a simple regulation affecting a handful of companies, and the cost, of course, would get passed on to the consumer. So, in the end, it would be good for renewables because it would make fossil energy more expensive, but there'd be no carbon taxes involved. There'd be no emission restrictions. There'd be no emission permits involved. You wouldn't be telling China how much CO2 they could generate. You simply say, if you want to use fossil energy, you have to start burying CO2. And the rate, if you want to sell fossil fuels, you have to start burying CO2. And the rate at which you bury CO2 has to go up in line with the overall carbon budget. We can afford the overall carbon budget of the planet. Norway could decide tomorrow to start using, to impose what we call this the sequestered adequate fraction of extracted carbon. This is the jargon we used for this kind of policy. It gives you a nice acronym, SAFE carbon. I like the idea of safe carbon. This is carbon that doesn't cause dangerous climate change. Norway could decide tomorrow to start using safe carbon, say, by 2020. What that would mean would be that Statoil, or anybody who imported carbon into Norway, would have to be able to show that for every ton of carbon they brought in, a steadily increasing fraction is being sequestered, such that by the time global emissions reach 1 trillion tons, that fraction reaches 100%, and that carbon is not contributing to dangerous climate change. If Norway can do this, you can turn around to your European partners and say, why don't you do the same? And Europe could be doing this for less than the cost of the ETS, or at least less than the cost of the ETS when the ETS was working. And then the big question, then how would we ever persuade China and India to do this? We don't have to persuade China and India to do this. China and India don't produce CO2. Lenovo, Foxconn produce CO2 from their activities, building, many of them, products which we buy in the West. All we have to do is turn around to Lenovo and Foxconn to say, if we're going to buy laptops and iPads from you, we want you to be able to show that these laptops and iPads have been made using safe carbon. Very rapidly, as multinationals discover they can't sell things unless they can prove that they've been made with fossil carbon that's not causing dangerous climate change, it'll become difficult for those evil fossil fuel companies to do anything other than sell safe carbon. And the whole problem will go away. This is something you can make happen. Of all the countries in the world, Norway you've got the technical resources, you've got the vision, and above all, you have the financial resources to adopt a mandatory sequestration regime, which would allow you to say to the rest of the world, look, the way we are using fossil carbon is not going to cause dangerous climate change. Now, how about you do the same? You've got a tradition of exploring and discovering new worlds. But it's very important. I was very encouraged to hear that from Emma Solberg that you are planning to do more on carbon capture. But I worry that doing more on carbon capture might mean building another Mongstad, okay? Don't go there. There's no point in discovering new worlds if you have to be as tough as a Norwegian to follow in your footsteps. Yeah, I mean, if the Vikings had discovered North America, but nobody else was able to follow, then so what? If you build demonstrator plants that are so expensive and so impressive that everybody else looks and admires but decides, well, we can't possibly afford that because we're not Norwegian, then there's no point. If, on the other hand, you can demonstrate to the world that you can work with the fossil fuel industry to solve the problem of climate change without restricting anybody's right to fossil carbon fueled development, and without spending a cent of taxpayers' money, crucially in this, all you have to do, as they did in the Gorgon gas project, all you have to do is tell the industry it needs to do it as a licensing condition. You don't have to spend your taxpayers' money on this. If you can demonstrate to the world that you can do that can be done, then you'll have definitely earned a place not just in the history of the 21st century, but I would say in the geological history of this planet. Thank you. And one big advantage of speaking just before dinner is I'm confident more than half the people in the room will violently disagree with most of what I've said, and I look forward to discussing this with you over dinner.